Thank you very much. You just move those up a bit. Good morning, everybody, and I'm sorry you're not present to hear this and ask questions. I've been asked to talk about what learning and positive experiences we can draw upon for the future from the pandemic. And I'm going to do that. Very much focusing on the experience within England, and just remind you that England has a somewhat different system of education to some of the other nations within the United Kingdom. And I want to start off with two quotes, which I think sort of characterize some of the points I want to raise. The first was written by someone from a progressive left-of-centre political group called Compass, and said, "Coronavirus has changed our world forever. Plans made a few weeks ago seem outdated at best or undoable at worst. The speed of this change has been remarkable." And I think that's some time ago now, and things have moved on. And I keep reminding myself of how people thought at that time. And it was a very sort of destabilized period. But it was also a period, certainly within a UK context, where there was much hope for a better society. And the reason for that, I think, was to do with incredible rapid change. You know, things that for years, in policy terms, people said, oh, we couldn't do that in society, we can't do that in schooling, suddenly seemed possible because of the crisis. I think the other reason why people expressed a lot of hope was to do with an enormous expression of compassion. And I'm sure that was expressed in different ways. In the UK, this was very much focused around the frontline workers in the National Health Service and the teachers who, because some of the schools did stay open, even from March, some of the schools stayed open for children with education healthcare plans. Those are the children with more severe special needs. So that is one theme I'm going to pursue. The other theme, which I think is related, and this is a quote by someone called Brahm, and you might have heard it. I remember when it was stated in 2008. You might remember the financial crisis or not, and that was, in a sense, a kind of preliminary. And Brahm, who happened to be Barack Obama's chief of staff, made this amazing statement: "Never let a serious crisis go to waste, to provide the opportunity to do things that were not possible to do before." And I guess that's sort of part of the Build Back Better, Build Back Fairer views that have been around. And I want to sort of pursue all that a bit. So what I want to just make sure what I want to cover is I want to talk a bit about the impact of the pandemic, particularly on the children and the young people, covering a bit of the ground that's already been covered. I want to talk about attainment gaps, and particularly socioeconomic disadvantage. And that's not because I think they're the only ones that are important, but because that is what certainly, where I come from, people have been very concerned about. I then want to focus it more specifically on the children and young people with special educational needs. And then I want to sort of look at two sources of data in some depth, because I think they have very clear implications and raise various policy issues. The first is a large primary school teacher study, the largest done, and was done in the sort of May, June of 2020. And the other is sort of evidence from various policy seminars that have been run by the Special Needs Policy Research Forum, which is a group that I co-coordinate. And we have a very wide group of stakeholders who discuss, debate, and take various positions. I also wanted to say a bit about the European agency's perspective, which is based on a Build Back Better approach, and then I want to make some sort of concluding comments. So the impact on school learning in general. As I said, this is a UK focus. There'll be some reference to European-wide research and very broad brush approach. We have something called the Education Endowment Foundation, which is a very large research organization set up as a charity, but it's very much linked with government. And they have summarized the research, which is that pupils have made less academic progress, the equivalent of what they would see as 2 months compared with the previous year group. So what we're interested in is what's happened over in the 2020 period in comparison with before. And of course, the big interest in the attainment gaps for pupils with a disadvantage and those without. And certainly the evidence consistently shows that those gaps have grown. And I think this is very much related to children from primary schools, whereas the data for secondary schools is inconsistent. So I think that's an important sort of distinction. Parent-teacher surveys also show, and of course this is the sort of common professional knowledge, and covered much in the media, that there are disparities in access to technology. This is a very big issue. I can't see that this is not an international issue. And also in levels of parental support based on whether parents were frontline workers or not. So you can see how a lot of socioeconomic factors which sort of kicked in, which really weren't operating so powerfully before. And the EEF say that this is in line with a review, Hammerstein's review in 2021 of international studies, and that most found negative effects of school closure on student achievement, particularly younger and more disadvantaged pupils. So that's very sort of quite a consistent picture. I want to say a bit about mental health. I don't want to say too much about mental health. And I think part of that is there's been a lot of reports about mental health impacts and so on, but there's only one study, and this is part of a longitudinal study, a large longitudinal study, which could actually then compare children, adolescents, and what are seen as sort of emergent adults, they're sort of 17 plus, using well-established measures over the period. And what they found was that children who probably had a mental health disorder, that's the phrase they use, probably, because these are based on measures and not actually face-to-face diagnoses. From 2017 to 2020, there was an increase from 1 in 9, almost 11%, to 1 in 6, almost 16%. And this was both for boys and girls. And I think that is in a sense seen as the highest quality research. They found for the older group, the 17 to 22-year-olds, that there was a very large gender difference, with women 27% versus young men 13%. And I think that is also of interest. I think it's also interesting to sort of see, if you look at these tables, which just summarize some of the points that come out of this study, that for children 5 to 16, if you compare those with and without probable mental health disorders, you can see a higher proportion of those without get regular support from school or college, and you can see the difference there. And you see the reverse there, again showing some of this showing the sort of socioeconomic differences, whether they live in a household which is falling behind in their payments, and you can see a very large gap between a higher proportion, 16 to 6%. Now, if you look at whether the parents and teachers, this was a view taken about whether lockdown made their lives work. So these are sort of reports. You can see in both the 11 to 16 and the young adult groups, you can see that those with mental health disorders saw things as getting worse. And you can see that consistently in both age groups. And if you look at the lowest table, you can see that for the middle group, the 11 to 16-year-olds, just over half said that lockdown made their lives worse, but a quarter said that lockdown made their lives better. So I think that sort of, and we've had that point being made, and I think it was implicit in one of the questions that was asked earlier, that people's responses are not always uniform. Now, this is another study which I think is interesting. This was a study commissioned by the EEF. And of course, in terms of its design, it also uses data that was collected before the pandemic in order to make a comparison. And I'll show you the timeline there because I think this is really shows you the sort of complexity of the comparisons you make. You see, they had 2019 test data. We're talking about primary school age, looking at reading and maths. And then they did another test in September. We're talking about September of last year, and then another one at the end of the term, which is the equivalent term that we are in now. And they also looked at, what was going on in the primary school, and there was teacher surveys at various times. And again, the focus, as I was saying, very much the focus in England is on this gap between those who have free school meals and those who are not. And they certainly found that the gaps widened in mathematics particularly, not so much in reading, between 10 and 24% widening of what is an existing gap. So I think these are fairly distinctive, but they didn't find any, when they did the comparison in the equivalent term of last year, and this is once schools had reopened last September, they didn't find any changes in the gaps between free schools and those not in maths or reading during that term. Now, they also tried to look at the attainment differences in terms of what the school's responses were, and this was done roughly in the summer term, as we would call it, of last year, was a link to the attainment gaps. And they found that none of these, sorry, I need to move this on, none of these factors, there was no evidence that these were linked to changes in the attainment gap. Whether that students were phoned at home, whether they made changes to the timetabling, whether they had live or recorded lessons, the frequency of work submission, and the use of technology platforms. Now, that could be that the research is somewhat crude, and that wouldn't surprise me, because these are large-scale surveys, and it's very difficult to sort of get a handle on some of these phenomena. So I want to sort of now focus it down on, well, what has the research been of a larger scale research on children with special educational needs? And this was funded, this is funded by the Nuffield Foundation, well-known research organization, and the National Foundation of Educational Research, and it was July or August 2020. And they took a representative sample of 200 senior teachers in special schools and colleges, 500 parents and carers, in-depth interviews with teachers, providers, and parents and carers. And their conclusions, again, I can't go into it, but their conclusions were very clear that the whole cohort of pupils with educational health care plans, these are the children who we would say have more severe. There are 3% of children with special educational needs. In England, we identify about 14 or 15%. There are many who have what we call school support special needs, and we're not talking about those. And also, those that came from the poorer backgrounds were faced with even greater challenges compared to their better off peers. So you have socioeconomic factors operating even within the group of children with more severe special educational needs. And the Nuffield NFPR study also came up with a sort of an overview. And their overview was that there was evidence of worse mental well-being, there was a loss of progress and skill, there was increased social isolation, physical deterioration, and a sense of uncertain futures. Now, I want to say a bit about some of the issues, and I'll come back to other issues, but I particularly want to focus on the socioeconomic disadvantage and that relationship with students with special needs and disabilities. And I thought I'd just show you these data, very up-to-date data, national data, on the proportion of pupils who have free school meals in primary schools. It's all pupils and secondary schools. And you'll see in both cases the proportions have risen over the period, which I think says something about pandemic. But look at the differences in 2019 between regular schools and special schools, because the special schools would all only have children with the more severe education health care plans, and pupil referral units, which are for children with behavioral conduct, some social, emotional, mental health difficulties, attendance problems, and you can see almost half of the pupils at pupil referral units and a slight increase come from socioeconomic. Now, that I think is sort of telling, but clearly not all children, as some of the SKIP research I've did, with special educational needs have socioeconomic disadvantages. Well, one of the things that has been very clear, and again, not well documented in the research, but certainly in our policy seminars, is that those with more severe difficulties did not get some of there was a real concern. So, for example, some children who had complex healthcare needs couldn't return to school. Even in September, they couldn't return to school, that's September of last year, because of PPE concerns. PPE was just not available, and there was a whole set of issues. And that has been documented, and I give a reference to that. So there is evidence of some real neglect in that area. Now, I want to sort of really look at two pieces of data in more detail, because I think these really say something about what we can learn. And this was a study done at the Institute of Education at London University about primary school teachers' experience, and they wanted to explore teachers' response to the COVID crisis, their priorities during lockdown as the schools reopened, and any lessons that could be learned. This was done in May of last year, 2020. And the reason I focus on it is partly because it is the largest sample research that I think is around, and it comes up with some very clear and important findings and recommendations. So I shall go through those. The first one is this idea that schooling is about more than learning. Now, you might not have this problem in Ireland, but I think this is an issue with a very strong testing system that we have in England, with a very strong inspection accountability system, where schools and school practices are very much influenced by that. Schools made up gaps in the local welfare provision. So, for example, they were providing food in some areas, home drop-offs, and etc. And one of the recommendations that came from that was the pupil and family welfare is a foundation for quality learning, that schools need appropriate levels of funding and mental health advice. A second area, related area, is the question of the duty of care. The duty of care falls unevenly across schools was this point, that responding to the effects of poverty and hardship was most in the disadvantaged areas. Teachers in those areas were doing tasks not typically considered within their role. And then, of course, the recommendation that comes from that is that the role of schools in disadvantaged areas needs recognizing and it needs funding. And there needs to be a targeting of such schools where necessary. The third area is to do with teachers during the lockdowns had to adapt quickly. Well, we know that. Teachers prioritized. They had to use engaging tasks and purposeful ones. They had to maintain prior learning. So the AIR emphasis was that there was evidence that they were trying to maintain and sustain prior learning rather than extending curriculum coverage. Again, one of the features of our strongly inspected school system is curriculum coverage, is keeping up, because that relates to the formal national assessments and testing. So there was a question of ensuring opportunities to learn to those without internet, and a quarter delivered copies of these teachers. A quarter of the teachers talked about delivering the copies of the materials to the home as a compensation for not having internet connection. So the recommendations are: the crisis has drawn attention to the unequal access to remote learning, and there's caution in turning to online resources. Teachers need to reflect on what has worked best for them. And one of the conclusions that was drawn from this study, and it's not totally up to date, but was that research on the quality online learning is equivocal. So in other words, there is a lot unknown, and I think that was touched on. The fourth area is the idea that literacy activities that the teachers were setting reflected the balance of the curriculum. So teachers were really prioritizing what they did. It's a sort of mark of how they adapted what they were teaching. Teachers followed tasks expected in the curriculum across the key stages. The key stages are the key stage 1 and 2 are the two primary stages. And the recommendation is that if there are any further future closures, one needs to encourage reading for pleasure and a balance between closed and open literacy and language tasks. And I think this is sort of linked in with the earlier point about the importance of setting work activities that are engaging and purposeful. The fifth broad area of findings and recommendations was the effect on the schools. The effect of lockdowns differed according to the social circumstances of the schools. All teachers reported worrying about the well-being of at least some pupils in the school, but in the most deprived communities, teachers were much more concerned than in the least deprived communities. All were aware of the adverse effect on academic progress, more so in schools in the more deprived areas. And from that, there are recommendations that schools are very well placed to assess the pupils' learning needs with the return to school, and that schools plan for sustained support for children's learning, that they need to plan over the medium to long term, and that planning is better than a quick spurt to catch up, for which there is a lot of external pressure. And I'll come back to that as to what reconstruction or catch-up or recovery means, because I think there's a big policy issue there. The sixth area is that teachers are aware of the social emotional needs of children and families as schools reopen, and that the disruption to schools had most effect on those who lived in stressful home circumstances. And of course, there's been a lot in the national media about abuse at home in various ways, because people have been thrust together in a way that they might not have been before. So the recommendation being the building of trust between schools and local communities at a time when further disruption is possible, and the importance of two-way communication, and that useful lessons are to be learned for parents' experience of supporting children in home learning. And for the last two areas, one of those is that many teachers have gained a better understanding of their community through the crisis. And I think this is sort of a more general point, that a lot of parents have learned a lot about their children's learning and schooling through the crisis that they might not have been involved in supervising home learning. So teachers have gained a different perspective on home-school relationships, how poverty and overcrowding impacts on pupils' lives and learning, and in the least deprived areas, how parents were able to support their children's learning. So the implication being to find better ways of recognizing impact that material disadvantages have for learners, and a review of the inspection, testing, and league table system post-COVID. And I think there is currently a big debate in the media about the use of inspection in schools, and maybe we could come to that. And the final one is that teachers do not want to return to business as normal in September. That was September of last year. That was the clearest survey finding of this teacher survey. A recognition of the school's role in building community resilience, the review of primary education, the curriculum and values and purposes, a recovery curriculum developed locally rather than a rapid catch-up. And we've had a whole lot of politics over catch-up and the resignation of the senior educationalists because the government refused to give the 15,000 that they were 15 billion that they were recommended to spend on this catch-up. So the recommendation is that the COVID crisis exposed deep inequalities in society, and schools should be given greater freedom to choose. And that was sort of picked up at the last presentation. I want to now move to the other area where I want to focus in a little more depth, which is the Special Needs Policy Research Forum and these policy seminars and research. And we ran a seminar in November, exactly this time last year, and we had presentations from researchers. We have a group of about 50 or 60 people who are very well placed, knowledgeable, teachers, parents, and so on, who then discussed. And the general conclusions from that seminar, which there are referenced to if you want to, if you see in the slides, is that about the inequality that was revealed by the COVID crisis, not just about special needs, but across the board, but having particular impact in the special needs area, the importance of socioeconomic disadvantage, and that the quality of pre-existing relationships and values in schools influenced how well the schools responded. So in a sense, the starting position of schools were important to their resilience in dealing with it. And this is a summary of some of the learning from the COVID crisis that came out of that seminar a year ago. The positives: parents appreciating what teachers were doing for their children, innovative online multi-agency approaches, people not having to travel miles to go and liaise, being able to communicate with parents more easily, significant professional learning about online learning, and about the changes and flexibility in organizing teaching and learning, sort of opening up a whole realm of potential. Those were seen as the sort of positives, but the negatives were obviously gaps in out-of-school provision, some schools not having supporting systems around them. In other words, the schools weren't well connected and well supported within the community, and that could be a factor. There were examples of unwelcoming schools. I gave you the example of children with complex health. There were issues of maybe outside the school's control, rare recognition for teachers' contributions during the periods. There were some teachers who felt that their contribution was not that well recognized, and of course some of the safeguarding concerns of children because they were thrust into living in close quarters. Now, the Policy Forum held another seminar, which was in April of this year, and here we were focusing on how are schools coping with the impact. And we had a set of conclusions that came out of the discussions of the seminar, but we did follow that up with a questionnaire. And these are the results of some of the sort of the predominant responses. And I think, again, they're interesting. A change in general approach. There was, when I say agree dominant means that the number of people who agree or agree strongly is more than double all the other responses. So it's a pretty strong view that both well-being and academic learning, catch-up as it's called, should be given equal priority. That's enormous policy significance, very strong view from the stakeholders. And of course, the questionnaire respondents were a whole range of people, from teacher educators to parents to voluntary groups to senior teachers, psychologists, and so on. That schools need permission to innovate more. That was another very strongly sort of learning. These were the lessons. These are the sort of dominant lessons that came out of this survey, and they aligned very, very strongly with what was said in the seminar. Now, I'm not claiming this is representative. It's not. It was a somewhat disappointing response to the questionnaire, but it shows what I would say an important constituency. I would dare say an informed constituency, educationally informed. Some children learn better at home than school, was one lesson. Blended learning opportunities can enhance, can enable future learning outside classrooms. Some removal of accountability measures showed how teachers could be flexible in meeting the needs of all children. Assessment should be focused on what is important to learn rather than what can just be measured. Success should be measured for all children in terms of their starting points. In other words, that's a sort of an issue of nationally prescribed tests that might not be relevant to some children with special educational needs. A renewed appreciation of the need for a diversity of teaching approaches, no one strategy that will fit all. To carry on, these are the lessons. Further, how SEND special educational needs interventions can benefit the whole population. These are sort of well-known positions. One of the things a lot of schools did is they had staggered starts, they had softer routines at break and lunch, and many people thought those were useful and could be continued. Online communications with parents had a positive impact on relationship building between home and school, was another lesson. Virtual meeting technology is time-saving and reduces travel times, and particularly in relation to multidisciplinary meetings and annual reviews. We have statutory annual reviews for children with education and healthcare plans. It takes up a lot of time. And it's important that there is a national plan for dealing with any future lockdowns or major disruption on the scale of COVID. Now, one of the questions we asked, and I think this is a very revealing question, and it bears on what I'm going to come to, is whether they thought that the lessons learned from the pandemic will influence policy and practice. And we offered them whether it would do so in your own setting, in your local area, which would be your local authority area, or nationally. And the view was quite clear. A very high probability was the dominant response to seeing it having some influence in their local setting. They had little trust that in the local authority area or nationally, those lessons would be learned. Now, we also asked what were the enabling lessons to be learned. In other words, what are the conditions that would make some of these lessons to be learned? And these were the dominant positions, that the window of opportunity for learning is narrow, with the government aiming to get back to schooling as before the pandemic. And as I said, what is currently going on now in the media, both at a political level and a professional level, illustrates that that window is almost closed. Learning lessons from the pandemic is not just about adding extra work, but knowing what to abandon, what to give up. And I will show you a model which I hope will sort of illustrate that point in a moment. Support is required for schools, including school governors, so that they lead on the lessons to be learned for future providers. Additional staff and funding are required to enable schools to provide for the child and young people's support, early identification, support services, therapy. And therapy is a very big issue. Child and adolescent mental health is a very big issue in England. particularly around the mental health services in the National Health Service, where what people get is assessment, but not much therapeutic intervention and technology. Carrying on the enabling factors, some moderation, some adaptation of the curriculum and assessment pressures on schools is necessary. It's very difficult for schools to do something different if they're judged by conventional results, which is the inspection framework. The Ofsted inspection framework needs to change to allow schools to be more flexible and to do something different to meet individual needs. And opportunities are needed for teaching staff to access supervision and to talk about the issues and challenges. And there need to be opportunities for rethinking the nature and purposes of schooling. Now, these people are saying some pretty important and serious points about the context and the policy context in which they are involved in schooling. Now, I just want to say a bit about the European Agency for Special Needs Education. They did a literature review, which I think is interesting because it sort of reflects their view. And they're a sort of a lead organization, not just for EU countries, but also for other European countries, though I regret to say that England is, or UK is no longer a member of that. They looked at this. This was looking at documents between March and December of 2020. This was published quite recently. And the European Agency has a set of principles about inclusive education, which they put forward in 2015. And they, on the basis of this review, came up with a suggestion for changing those principles so that they are relevant to a crisis condition. And I won't go through all of those, but you'll see it's about raising the achievement of learners, the stakeholders' engagement, the flexible use of continua, and I think that's a really important emphasis, the flexible use of continua provision, the use of more personalized approaches, and so on. Now, I think the thing about the European agency's message is, and I think this is a view that many people have, and it's implicit in what I was saying from one of the policy women, is that COVID-19 has been considered both a challenge but also an opportunity. And it's an opportunity to review and implement more inclusive legislation and policies and actions across Europe, to build back better. This very strong message of building back better linked to education is predominant, with equality and inclusion as the core values. And I want to say something about the way Build Back Better has been corrupted as a message. Limited evidence on funding or guidance for inclusion in education, school closures increased pre-existing inequalities, initial measures to support vulnerable learners focused on access, but there's little evidence of their effectiveness. So this is picked up both at a European level and in some of the English studies. The focus on the need for coordination and remediation to reduce learning loss with the potential for long-term consequences, and multiple examples of limited or absent access to education for vulnerable learners, and how various judicial, legal, other means have been used to try and compensate for that. Now, I want to very quickly show you a model which I have found very useful, and I came across this really early on. It comes from RSA, which is a well-known policy unit in England called the Royal Society for Arts, and they had this Build Back Better model. It actually converges very strongly with an approach from a French philosopher called Bruno Latour, and basically what one's doing is saying, well, during the crisis, were new things started, were some things stopped, and then as the crisis moves on, or maybe in the sort of post-crisis, but it's not a clear distinction as we know, certain things might have been stopped that had been started, and certain things might have been restarted. And if you cross those two elements of stopping and starting from the during to the post, you end up with some four very interesting options. The first one is that you started something in the crisis because of the immediate demands, but they were specific to the crisis, and you really don't want to carry on with them, and there are many examples of that. But there's some things that are started during the crisis that you might want to carry on reusing, and those were what the RSA model calls amplifying. So they're new practices, and I think certainly the IT and the more flexible learning, those are certainly in that area. But the interesting bit is of those things that were stopped during the crisis, things that were stopped, and you no longer want to carry on using them. In other words, you want to let go of them or abandon them or, dare I say, reject them. And I think that primary school study is a very interesting one, because I think there are indications in that teachers want things to be let go. They want things to change. And I don't see that as an area that has been that well developed. And maybe it's early times. And then things that were stopped, but they were stopped so they couldn't be done, but they need to be picked up. And I mean, there are many examples of that. So I think that's a useful model. I give you the reference. So I have 4 minutes, and I am almost finished. I hope to finish by then. So my concluding comments, try and pull this together a bit. I think the main thing I would say is you can't separate out a focus on special needs and disability, or what we sometimes call additional needs or vulnerable children and young people, from the general system. Strong interconnection, interdependence. And I wonder whether the European agency is a bit too separatist, despite its inclusive principles, because I think one of the things about inclusive education in what they call disability inclusion is that it still has a sort of separatist element to it. I think the other point I would make is there's been a capture of the Build Back Better message in political rhetoric. The Conservative Party had Build Back Better as its main slogan. The new Secretary of State is talking about building back better and building back fairer. The extent to which that's being done with equity and inclusion as its core, I'm not sure. And in a way, it becomes damaged terminology, because I don't think it does the work. So we need to go further than hopeful slogans, is my view. Clearly, the impact of COVID on society and education, there are big questions of, can we expect change to be in the near future, or will the impact be slow and indirect? And I was very interested to read a historical study of the pandemic of the early part of the 20th century, which has in many ways been wiped from the history. Not much commemoration, memorials about it. But actually, this historian was saying that in the 20s, the 1920s and 30s, there were major social changes. It's a slow process of responding to this. It's like it takes time to digest it. So that issue of immediate versus delayed is a really interesting one. And I would say that the COVID crisis reveals a whole lot of policy tensions. And I want to just very quickly show you the ones that I can identify, and this is just my little attempt. I think under the issue of control, there are issues about, does the government determine adaptations to curriculum, teaching or assessment, or is there going to be more school flexibility over curriculum, teaching and assessment, maybe within a broader, looser national framework? That is a perennial historical curriculum issue. We have a particular problem, which is the English problem, about that, and different countries, I know the Scandinavians have a very different approach on their curriculum. Additional funding, is that to be centrally distributed and prescribed, or is there going to be some more local decision-making? That's also a big issue about the centralization or local determination. So these are perennial issues that come up in this form. Is there a standard model of school management, or are schools going to be encouraged, like in that primary school survey, where some schools in certain communities really need to adapt more to local circumstances? The issue about what is your education focus, in other words, what is the purpose of school education? What is the priority? Are schools for closing attainment gaps? Is that the primary area? Or are schools also there to support children's mental health and well-being? That's a big and continuing issue. So is it about catching up attainment gaps? The government in England are spending $5 billion rather than the $15 billion that their expert committee said they should. And are we going to have a more broader approach to recovery and build in ideas of well-being into that? And then the crisis approach. Are we going just to return to prior? All right, we just want to go back to business as usual, nothing's going to change. Or are we going to reconstruct the prior? And of course, this is another issue that has a long term. And that's the connected issue of, are we going to do this as rapidly as possible, try and forget what we've been through, or are we going to have a longer process? So my very last, I've got to say, I'm really running up against time, is the question of, let me give you a comment about England, and this might apply elsewhere, I'm sure it does, is a need for more reflection, democratic deliberation, and considered decision-making in education. I see in England a persistence of policy failure, and I see that as part of wider education policy failure, which illustrates general democratic deficits in the education and policy-making processes. And I follow the analysis of the political sociologist Colin Crouch, who talks about a post-democracy analysis. I've given you a reference to a paper I've written about this. Basically, we have a disconnect between politics and the profession and all the stakeholders in education. And based on a strong interconnection between special educational needs inclusion with other aspects of education, policy, I think, could better reflect stakeholders' perspectives. We need more public deliberation and choice about inclusive education, the use of citizens' assemblies and conventions, of which I know in Ireland you have made very good use of, and even our select committees in the House of Commons do so too. But they still make rather little difference, and we can go into that later if you want to discuss it. And my recommendation is we need non-governmental, we need bottom-up to challenge the policy making, so non-governmental policy initiative. I see this in the form of an education framework commission that could take a 10-year perspective and to see that both as contributing to education policy and inclusive education policy, but also a form of public education about society and education. So those are my views. Those are my very particular views. Take them or leave them. If you want to follow up some of what I've said, I'm shooting over time. There are some references. Sorry about that.